Welcome to another week of Art Club. This is another video for Art Club, and we're basically going to be continuing on what we did last week. So in last week's video, I basically spoke about shading techniques, what they're used for, how we use them, why we use them, that we can use them for different mediums. We can use them, we can shade with pencil crayons, we can shade with chalk pastels, we can shade with markers sometimes, and we can shade with pencils, of course. One of the, pencils is one of the most popular mediums to use when shading. So, we already discussed that we have different shading techniques. And what we did last week was a stippling shading technique. So today I'm going to show you how to do the cross hatching technique, the scumbling technique, and the hatching technique, and just a regular shading technique. So for this presentation, I'm going to be using a marker and my board. I would suggest, because you're learning how to do shading and you want to do it right, and this is your first time doing it, or you want to practice it and you want to make portraits, I would suggest to use a pencil, but I'm just going to be demonstrating with a marker and a board. So a pencil would be your best choice. If you have different pencils, for example, when drawing, you have different types of pencils. You have 1B, 2B, 3B, 4B. And what these pencils are, they're different shadings. So the 1B is the lightest, 2B, is kind of medium. The 3B kind of is like going to like dark to medium. The 4B is dark, and then the 5B is the darkest. So if you have drawing pencils, this is the best time to use them because it will help you to make an easy transition from lighter to darker. If you don't have drawing pencils, that is also okay. Just do it step by step. So just shade from lighter to darker. There's also the smudging technique. And with the smudging technique, it's best, the smudging technique is used best when you are using a pencil, because you use a pencil to create the art piece, and then you just use your finger, or you can use a piece of tissue to just smudge the art from lighter to darker. So I would suggest, if you are going to be doing this project along with me right now, that you get a pencil and a paper. As far as a smudging technique, it's very difficult to use the medium of a marker, or to use the medium of pencil crayons when smudging. The greatest thing about pencils is that it has lead in it, and the lead is what is easily used to create that smudge effect. One of the greatest things about the smudging technique too is that you can practice how using charcoal or chalk pastel, because charcoal and chalk pastel is like chalk, and it's very dusty like chalk, and so it's the easiest way to smudge. If you're learning how to smudge, if your favorite shading technique is smudging, I would use chalk pastels or charcoal, because as we know, chalk is very soft like powder, so it's very easy to smudge and to like go around. So if you feel like you like the smudging technique, I would use chalk pastel and pencils, along with showing you guys how to create the smudging techniques. I will begin to show you a little bit about what we did when it comes to storyboarding, because we did storyboarding the week before last, and I just want to basically show you guys what storyboarding is about. So before we start the smudging technique, before we start the shading techniques, before we start the storyboarding, I'll explain to you a little bit what storyboarding is. So storyboarding is basically what they use when when people are creating films or movies, series, or just cartoons, animations, anything. So the storyboards are usually different stills, they're different scenes, they're different frames drawn out to show how the story is going to go. So it's very similar to when you have a comic book and different things are happening in different boxes. So in a storyboard, you create different boxes based on how long your story is. But you don't have to put like a whole full scene, you just put the important scenes. And you just basically go step by step. It's like you're doing scene one. It's like you're doing step one, step two, step three. So you're telling the story, but you're drawing. You're using drawings to show it. One of the reasons I think it's important, if you like drawing, to do storyboard is because it helps with your creativity. It helps you to think of new ideas. It helps you to think of new stories. It helps you to understand the concept. So storyboarding is usually used for film. It's usually in the film department. And film is an art. Film is a type of art. But if animation or anything like that is something that interests you, or writing, maybe you're good in English and you love to write and you love drawing, storyboard is a good combination of the two because it's based on your drawings and it's based on your writing, your story you've written, and then you put it all together and create it and make it into a drawing. So I'm going to show you guys the shading techniques first, and then I will go on to show you the storyboard. So now grab your pencil and papers. So if you have a big paper, I would just suggest using the inside of a tape or a cup. You can turn a cup upside down and just create a circle. The circle, this is just practice, so the circle does not have to be perfect. So it can be small, it can be as big, we're just practicing. And I would suggest that you do this on a piece of paper that you're gonna save, because you always wanna look back at how you started out when you shading, and then you wanna look at your progress later on. And I would also just like to, if you're doing this technique and this is something you want to do, and you think it's something you might want to do again, it would be a good idea for you just to keep the drawings that we're going to do now, because then you can look back and you can think, oh, maybe for this drawing I want to do this shading technique, or you can look back and you can say, okay, now I remember how to do a specific shading technique. So now just get your pencil and paper and just create a circle. So what we can do is we can create 4 different circles, because we're going to do hatching, cross hatching, scrumbling, and smudging. So I'm going to create 4 small circles. Your circles can be as big or as small as you want to. I just said, remember, it would be a good idea if you keep them. So make it, if you're gonna do big ones, just make sure you keep those big papers. I would suggest to use, you can do any size you want to, but I would suggest to use a big enough paper, or if you don't have a big enough paper, just paper that can fit all 4 circles. So we're doing hatching, cross hatching, scumbling, and smudging. Because I'm using a marker, the smudging might be a little bit difficult for me, but I will explain how to do it so you can practice on your own. So the first thing we're going to do is cross hatching. So I created 4 small circles. So the first thing when you're doing cross hatching is, actually let's do hatching first. So hatching is basically just creating lines. That's all it is. What you want to do is, let's say I want my shadow to be right here. What you're going to do is you're going to create a shadow. You want your light to be right here. Let's say I want my light to be right here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a circle and leave that circle white while I'm shading everything else. So with hatching, what you're gonna do is you're just making lines, but closer to the bottom, because you want it to be darker, you make more lines at the bottom. You just create more lines, and you make these lines closer so it can create the dark effect. So the closer you get to the top, like so, you spread the lines out more. See? You spread the lines out more, and you don't make it be as clustered as the ones at the bottom. So because the light is coming from here, that means that over here is going to be dark. So what I want to do is I want to add more lines to make it look, I'm going to add the lines closer together so it looks darker on this side. So just do it along with me. So I'm just adding more lines, more lines, more lines, but I want to leave up here as light as possible because this is where the light is coming from, so it's going to be less lines. So more lines, more lines, more lines, more lines. So just like at the bottom, you can create smaller lines. So these lines are vertical, okay guys? You can do horizontal lines, but always if you're doing hatching, you're doing it in one direction. So it's either vertical or horizontal. It's not both. That's when it becomes cross hatching. So you're just creating more lines and you're creating them closer, but you're leaving up here lighter because we're going from lighter to darker, lighter to darker. So now what you want to do is you want to take your eraser and you just want to erase that black line that you made before. That line that you made before for the light, you just want to erase it. So you kind of just want to make more lines, more lines, more lines. So this is basically hatching. So we're going from a light source to it has less light. There's more light in between the lines, and then darker. So light, more light in between the lines, and then darker. The lines are closer and the lines are more attached. So light, less light in between these lines, and then darker, darkest. So this is basically hatching. So cross hatching is basically this. It's the same thing you just did. So let's say we put the circle in the same direction. So we put the circle right here. We're putting the circle right here. Maybe this circle is a little bit smaller than the one we did before. It depends on your light source. So now we can start off how we just did hatching, right? So now we can go like this, just like how we just did hatching. But maybe we're spreading out the lines at the top bigger. But then these lines, we're going to make them smaller, like what we did just now with hatching. We're making it smaller and smaller and smaller because we want here to look darker and darker and darker. So we're making it smaller, 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 smaller. So now, what do we do to differentiate between hatching and cross hatching? We do the same thing we just did, but in the opposite direction. So now we're doing vertical lines going across. So now we're doing vertical lines going across. So basically you're adding the vertical lines that you're adding horizontal lines, going across to the vertical lines that you just created. So then closer to the top, because remember, closer to the top, we don't want it to be as dark as the other lines. So closer to the top, we're just going to put a small line through, a thinner line through, and a thinner line through. And that's it. We're not going to touch it. We want there to be space in between because this is where the light is coming from. So when we erase this circle, it looks like it's going from lighter to darker. So let's just add one more circle just for an example. One more line. So we add a vertical line, and then we just add a line going like this, and a line going like this, leaving as much space in between them. So you can see that is going from white to darker, from white to darker. So you're leaving as much space in between so you can show that we're doing shading. So it's going from it's going from light where the light source is, space in between to represent that this is the less part, this is not the darkest part. It's going from light to a little bit darker to dark and then darkest. Okay? And the next one we're going to do is scrumbling. So scrumbling might be the funnest one. So even scrumbling might be the funnest one because it's the only technique that you don't have to necessarily follow the rules in. So scrumbling is basically just literally scrumbling. Like when you would be in classes or you're just like doodling, you would go like this. You literally just start scrumbling. But remember, we're not just scrumbling. We're doing shading. We're practicing shading techniques. So what we do is we're scrumbling, but we're making here darker. So darker, darker. And again, guys, like you add your light wherever you want it. So let's add the light over in this side. Okay? But you can add your light whenever you want to. I would add it first, but so okay, so darker, darker, darker. Follow along with me. Darker, darker, darker. And then we start kind of doing lighter scrumbles. Lighter, less and less scrumbles. The closer we get to the top, we're doing lighter scrumbles. So maybe darker here, and then we stop. And maybe we just make just a little bit down the bottom. We maybe just might make this like a little darker. And then we just erase the line. And then we just like make the scrumbles as bigger as possible. See? So it goes from light to darkest. Light to darkest. This is the funnest technique, I think. I think this is the funnest technique. So the next technique is smudging. So with smudging, it's very hard to show with a marker, so I'm going to just explain. I'm going to try my best to show with the marker, but I'm going to explain too. So with smudging, you literally are just shading. So we're going to, shading is the #1 shading technique, the traditional shading technique. I'm going to do that one last. That is the #1 shading technique, the traditional one. But smudging is literally, you're just shading. Again, I said it's hard to do with a marker, but it's just, you're just shading from darker. You're shading from darker, and then it's going to lighter. I'm sorry, guys. This is very hard to do with a marker to demonstrate. But basically, you shade from darkest, you go dark. So let me just use arrows to make it easier. Dark, let's say medium in between, and then light. So this would be the lightest area. And then so when you're using your pencil and you're using whatever actually yes, when you're using your pencil or charcoal or chalk pastel, what you basically do is you just, let's say this is the darkest part, you just basically smudge. You smudge. Of course, I'm using a marker, I'm using a board. It's gonna be erased, but you just smudge it in. So you go from lightest to darkest, and you just smudge the darkest area, make it look dark, and then you slowly start smoothing it out to make it blend together. That's the whole point. And then the #1 shading technique is, of course, to just use your pencil or marker and just shade. So shade, shade. This part, I want it to be the darkest. Right? You want here to be the darkest, and then you start shading closer to the top. You make it lighter and lighter, and then eventually you just stop at the light. So you just go from darker, you keep going up to make it darker, darkest. So you start from, I'll use labels since it's harder to show with a marker. So if you have a circle like this, what you're gonna do is darkest, darkest, dark, medium, light, and then white. Okay, so you can use this as a guide. So white as in like you're not coloring anything else. Light as in like it's lighter. And then medium means it's kind of in between dark and then darkest. So when you're shading, you can follow this. You just put it right beside. So the bottom part of the circle should be the darkest. The second to bottom part should be dark. In between should be medium, light, and then white. Okay, guys? So we talked a little bit about the storyboards earlier and I explained it. So that's what we will be doing in the next video, is demonstrating a little bit about the storyboards and how to do it and how to put a storyboard together. So I hope to see you in the next video. I hope this video was helpful. I hope you watch the next video, because the next video we will be discussing about the storyboards. Okay? So thank you for watching.